Hey, don't move. Step away from the car right now.
Officer, this is my home. What's going on?
I asked you a question. You matched the description we received.
I haven't done anything.
Turn around for me, please.
You're making a serious mistake.
At 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Alexandria, Virginia, inside one of the most exclusive gated communities in the D.C. metro area, a black woman stood alone in her driveway loading luggage into the back of a silver Lexus SUV. Her name was Nadine Ashford. She was 54 years old. She had been a United States federal judge for 11 years, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and assigned to a bench where she had handled hundreds of cases involving constitutional law, civil rights, and federal criminal matters. That morning, she wore no robe and carried no gavel. She was dressed in a casual travel outfit, yoga pants, a zip-up jacket, and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was heading to Dulles International Airport to catch a 9:15 flight to Chicago for a federal judicial conference where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on the future of due process in immigration law. Her carry-on sat on the curb. A garment bag hung from the rear door handle. A travel mug of coffee rested on the roof of the car. Everything about the scene was ordinary, a woman leaving her home on a quiet weekend morning. But what happened in the next 11 minutes would trigger a federal investigation, destroy careers inside one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country, and send shockwaves from a suburban driveway all the way to the halls of Congress. At 6:17 a.m., 3 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Ashford Street and rolled to a stop directly in front of her driveway, blocking her vehicle completely. 6 agents in tactical vests exited in formation. The letters ICE were printed across their chests. The lead agent was Craig Delano, 43 years old, a supervisory detention and deportation officer with 16 years in federal law enforcement. He had a reputation inside his field office for running aggressive operations, for pushing boundaries that other supervisors walked carefully around, and for a pattern of complaints from communities of color that had been quietly filed and never acted upon. He approached Ashford with his hand resting on his sidearm, his posture wide, his jaw set. "You, stop what you're doing. Step away from the vehicle." Ashford turned slowly, both hands visible, one still holding a folded jacket. She looked at the agents, then at Delano. "Can I help you?" Delano didn't answer the question. "You match the description of a person of interest in an active immigration enforcement operation. I need to see identification. Now." Ashford set the jacket on the bumper. Her voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who had spent over a decade controlling courtrooms. "I'm Judge Nadine Ashford. I'm a federal judge with the United States District Court. This is my home." Delano's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the SUV, then back at her. "Sure you are." He turned his head slightly toward the agent behind him. "She's being evasive. Watch her hands." Ashford didn't flinch. "Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle." Her voice stayed level but firm. "Yes, you do. You are on private property. You have not identified a crime. You have not presented a warrant. As a matter of law, you do not have authority to detain me." Delano stepped closer, close enough that his vest nearly touched her shoulder. "I don't answer to you. Turn around. Now." Ashford held his gaze. "I'm asking you one more time. Do you have a warrant?" Delano said nothing. His hand moved from his sidearm to her arm. Across the street, a porch light clicked on. A curtain moved in a second-floor window. An older man in a bathrobe stepped outside and stood motionless on his front lawn, phone already raised. Neighbors were watching, and someone had already pressed record. Agent Tara Schofield, 31, second in command on the team, and 7 years into a career she had built by never questioning the lead agent on any operation, moved silently behind Ashford. She positioned herself at the judge's left shoulder, cutting off any path of retreat, her hands already reaching forward. Delano grabbed Ashford's right arm and spun her body toward the SUV. The motion was fast and violent. Ashford's shoulder struck the side mirror with a dull crack that echoed across the quiet street. Her coffee mug slid off the roof and shattered on the driveway. She didn't scream, She didn't swing. She planted her feet and said clearly, loud enough for every agent and every neighbor now stepping outside to hear, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Delano's voice came back hard. "Stop resisting." She was not resisting. Her hands were open. Her body was still. Schofield grabbed her left arm and wrenched it behind her back. Together they forced her forward, pressing her chest against the hood of her own vehicle, the metal still cold from the morning air. Delano snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them tighter than necessary. Ashford's cheek pressed against the paint. Her glasses fell from her head and landed on the concrete. From across the street, a voice cut through the scene like a blade. "That's Judge Ashford." "What the hell are you doing?" The man crossing the lawn was Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68 years old, retired United States Air Force, 30 years of service, a man who had commanded squadrons overseas, and now lived 3 houses down from a woman he had known for nearly a decade. He moved fast for his age, bathrobe open, slippers on wet grass, finger pointed directly at Delano. Delano turned. "Sir, get back, now, or you will be detained for obstruction of a federal operation." Pratt didn't move. Behind him, through the front window of his home, his wife was already on the phone with 911, her voice shaking as she described what she was watching from her living room. Without a word of explanation, the agents began searching Ashford's vehicle. No consent was given, no warrant was produced, no inventory sheet was started. They opened the rear hatch and pulled out her suitcase, unzipping it on the driveway. They went through her clothes, her toiletry bag, her shoes. They opened her purse and emptied it onto the hood beside her, wallet, keys, lipstick, reading glasses, case, all of it spread out in plain view of the growing crowd. Then they reached the briefcase. It was a leather attaché case with a combination lock, which one of the agents forced open. Inside were sealed federal court documents stamped with case numbers and classification markings, a judicial ID badge from the United States District Court, credentials issued by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts bearing her photograph, her name, and her title. Delano picked up the judicial ID and held it in front of his face. He stared at it. The photo matched the woman on the hood. The name matched the name she had given. The seal was authentic. Schofield leaned over his shoulder and read the credentials. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but everyone watching felt it. The air shifted. The truth was sitting in Delano's hand, laminated and embossed with the seal of the federal judiciary. But instead of uncuffing her, instead of stepping back and recognizing the magnitude of what he had done, Delano doubled down. He turned to his team. "Finish the sweep. These could be forged." Ashford, still pressed against the hood of her own car in her own driveway, spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 11 years on the federal bench. "You are now searching sealed federal court documents without authorization. You have committed multiple federal crimes." At the back of the formation, the youngest agent on the team, Kyle Rennick, 28, barely a year out of the academy, stood motionless. His face was pale. He leaned towards Schofield and said quietly, "We need to stop." Schofield didn't look at him. Her jaw tightened. "Shut up." By now, 7 neighbors stood on the street and across lawns in various states of Saturday morning dress. Bathrobes, slippers, coffee cups still in hand. 4 of them had phones raised, recording from different angles. The red lights on their screens blinked steadily. Colonel Pratt had not moved from the edge of the driveway. He stood with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking loudly and deliberately to the 911 dispatcher, making sure his voice carried. "I am reporting an unlawful arrest in progress. Federal agents have detained a sitting United States federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant has been presented. She is in handcuffs. I need local police here immediately." A woman appeared from 3 doors down, walking fast across the wet grass. She was Beverly Osei, 46 years old, a tenured professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center, a published scholar on Fourth Amendment protections and federal overreach, and a woman who had known Nadine Ashford for 6 years as a neighbor and a friend. She stepped onto the driveway and spoke directly to Delano. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the precision of someone who had argued before appellate courts. I know this woman. She is a sitting Article 3 federal judge appointed under the Constitution of the United States. You are violating 18 U.S.C. 111, which prohibits assault on a federal officer, and 18 U.S.C. 1501, which prohibits obstruction of judicial process. Uncuff her immediately. Delano turned toward her, jaw tight. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back. Leave now, or you will be placed under arrest for interference with a federal operation. Osei did not move. Not one step. She held her phone steady at chest level, the camera pointed directly at Delano's face. I'm a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. I'm not leaving. And neither is my camera. Schofield shifted behind Ashford, glancing at the growing number of recordings, the witnesses, the retired colonel, still narrating into his phone. For the first time, something in her posture changed. Not guilt, not conscience, just the faint awareness that the ground beneath this operation had already given way. Delano stepped away from the driveway and walked toward the lead Suburban. He pulled his phone from his vest pocket and dialed. The neighbor footage captured what followed from a distance, but with perfect clarity. Delano pacing in a tight circle beside the vehicle, his free hand rubbing his forehead, then gripping the back of his neck, his voice rising, though the words were not fully audible. His gestures sharp and agitated. He was calling his field office supervisor. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he returned to the driveway, his face had changed. The aggression was still there, buried just beneath the surface, but layered now with something else, something closer to damage control. He walked to Ashford, still pressed against the hood, and unlocked the cuffs without a word of explanation. He didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge the badges, the credentials, the sealed court documents now scattered across the trunk of her car. He stepped back and said flatly, "There's been a mix-up." "You're free to go." Ashford straightened slowly. She rolled her shoulders, wincing as the left one moved. The bruise from the side mirror was already darkening beneath her jacket. She looked down at her wrists. The cuff marks were deep and red, pressed into her skin like brands. Her glasses lay cracked on the concrete. Her suitcase was open on the driveway, clothes spilling out. Her briefcase had been forced open, and sealed federal documents lay fanned across the trunk, exposed to the morning air and every camera still recording. She looked directly at Delano. Her voice was steady, controlled, and unmistakable. This was not a mix-up. This was a choice. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out her own phone, and began recording. She panned slowly across the scene, the cuffs on the ground, the scattered documents, the 6 agents standing in a loose formation, none of them making eye contact, the 3 black SUVs still blocking her driveway, the neighbors on the street. She narrated as she filmed, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of a woman who understood the power of a record. My name is Judge Nadine Ashford. I am a United States federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. Today is Saturday. It is approximately 6:30 a.m. I was detained in handcuffs in my own driveway by agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. No warrant was presented. No probable cause existed. I was not told what crime I was suspected of. My vehicle was searched. Sealed federal court documents were handled without authorization. I was arrested in my own driveway because I am black. Within 30 minutes of the SUVs pulling away from her street, the first calls began. They moved fast, and they moved in every direction. Colonel Eldon Pratt stood in his kitchen, still in his bathrobe, and dialed a friend he had served with decades earlier who now held a senior advisory position at the Pentagon. He described what he had watched from his front lawn. His voice was controlled but furious. They cuffed a federal judge on the hood of her own car. I watched them do it. There was no warrant. There was no reason. She told them who she was and they didn't care. 3 doors down, Beverly Osei sat at her dining table and called the dean of Georgetown University Law Center. She gave a precise, unemotional summary of the legal violations she had witnessed and told the dean she intended to file formal statements with every relevant oversight body before the end of the day. 2 streets over, a neighbor named Franklin Yates forwarded his phone video to his daughter in Maryland, who worked as a junior editor at the Washington Post. She watched it once, then walked it directly to her supervising editor. Judge Ashford sat in her living room with an ice pack on her shoulder and called the chief judge of her circuit. She did not raise her voice. She did not break down. She spoke the way she had spoken on the bench for 11 years, with precision and weight. I was just arrested by ICE in my driveway. I was cuffed, searched, and humiliated. There was no warrant. The chief judge made one call to the administrative office of the U.S. courts. The administrative office contacted the Department of Justice Inspector General. The DOJ IG contacted the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. DHS OIG contacted ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility. Each call was shorter than the last. Each one carried more urgency. By 8 a.m., less than 2 hours after Delano had first stepped out of his Suburban, the machinery of federal accountability was in full motion. Back at the ICE field office in Fairfax, Craig Delano sat at a desk in a windowless room and typed his incident report. His version of events bore no resemblance to what had actually happened on that driveway. He wrote that he had encountered an uncooperative individual who refused to identify herself and physically resisted agents during a lawful enforcement action. He wrote that the subject became combative and that the force used was necessary and proportional. He described the detention as routine. He made no mention of the judicial ID, no mention of the sealed court documents, no mention of the 7 witnesses, no mention of the cameras. He filed the report at 9:47 a.m. and flagged it as a standard field encounter with no further action required. Agent Tara Schofield read the report, added her electronic signature without a word of objection, and returned to her desk. Then Delano walked the document to Kyle Rennick. The youngest agent on the team sat in a chair near the back of the office, his jacket still on, his hands clasped between his knees. He had not spoken since they returned from the operation. Delano placed the report in front of him and pointed to the signature line. Rennick read it. His eyes moved across the words, then stopped. He looked up. That's not what happened. Delano leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words stayed between them. Sign it, or your career is over. Rennick looked at the report. He looked at Delano, and he signed. But that night, alone in his apartment, Kyle Rennick sat on the edge of his bed and dialed the DHS Office of Inspector General anonymous hotline. His voice was quiet but steady. He identified himself by badge number. He said the incident report filed that morning by Supervisory Officer Craig Delano was fabricated. He said every material claim in it was false. He said the subject had been compliant, had identified herself clearly, had been a federal judge, and had been cuffed, searched, and humiliated without a warrant or probable cause. He said he would cooperate fully with any investigation, and then he asked for one thing: whistleblower protection. Because the man who had told him to sign that report was the same man who had put a federal judge in handcuffs that morning, and Rennick had seen exactly how far Delano was willing to go. Monday morning at 8 a.m., the DHS Inspector General formally opened an investigation into the detention of federal judge Nadine Ashford. By 8:30, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had assigned a team of attorneys to the case. By 9:15, the FBI was looped in, and the reason was simple. Federal judicial officers are protected under federal law. Assaulting or interfering with a sitting federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 111. Threatening or retaliating against a federal judge is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. 115. This was not an internal affairs matter. This was not a policy review. This was a criminal investigation. FBI agents arrived at the ICE field office in Fairfax before lunch. They came with subpoenas and forensic technicians. They seized body cam footage from every agent on the team. They pulled GPS data from all 3 Suburbans. They copied radio communications from the morning of the incident. And they took Delano's operational planning documents, the targeting files, the address lists, the authorization memos, every piece of paper that was supposed to justify what happened on that driveway. What they found in those documents changed the shape of the entire investigation. There was no warrant for Nadine Ashford. There was no warrant for her address. There was no warrant for anyone at that address. There was no warrant for anyone on her street. The enforcement operation that morning had been targeting an individual in a neighboring zip code more than 2 miles away, in a different subdivision, on a street with a different name. Ashford's home was never part of any authorized federal action. Craig Delano had gone to the wrong street. And rather than verify, rather than pause, rather than check the address against his own operational file, he had looked at a black woman standing in a driveway and decided she was the target. FBI Digital Forensics spent the next 48 hours recovering and cataloging body cam footage from 3 agents on Delano's team, including Delano's own camera and Schofield's. The footage was time-stamped, geotagged, and continuous. It showed everything. It showed Ashford turning slowly with her hands visible. It showed her calm voice identifying herself as a federal judge. It showed Delano scoffing. It showed him grabbing her arm and spinning her into the side mirror of her own vehicle. It showed Schofield wrenching her other arm behind her back. It showed them pressing her face against the hood and cuffing her while she repeated, clearly and without hysteria, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." It showed Ashford's body going still, fully compliant, not a single movement that could be characterized as resistance by any use of force expert in the country. It showed the agents tearing through her vehicle without consent, without a warrant, without documentation. It showed Delano holding her judicial ID badge in his hand, reading it, pausing, and then ordering his team to finish the sweep. It showed the sealed federal court documents being pulled from her briefcase and spread across the trunk, and it showed one moment that would become the most replayed clip in the entire investigation. Kyle Rennick leaning towards Schofield and whispering, "We need to stop," and Schofield, without turning her head, whispering back, "Shut up." Every frame of the footage directly contradicted every line of the incident report Delano had filed. Every claim of resistance was a lie. Every claim of combative behavior was fabricated. Every justification for force was invented. The neighbor videos, 4 separate angles recorded from phones across the street, corroborated the body cam footage frame by frame, word by word, second by second. A senior FBI analyst assigned to the case reviewed the combined footage, all 7 recordings synced to a single timeline, and wrote a single line in the official case file that would follow Craig Delano for the rest of his life. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of unlawful arrest, excessive force, and false reporting I have reviewed in 22 years of federal law enforcement. ICE leadership moved fast, but not fast enough. By Monday afternoon, Craig Delano and Tara Schofield were placed on immediate unpaid suspension. Their badges were confiscated. Their credentials were deactivated. Their access to federal systems was revoked. The field office director in Fairfax, a two-year veteran named Leonard Stokes, was quietly reassigned to an administrative role at a regional processing center, removed from command without public explanation. A joint statement was drafted between ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. It went through 4 revisions. Legal teams on both sides argued over language. They wanted to express concern without admitting liability, to acknowledge the incident without conceding wrongdoing. They planned to release it Wednesday morning with carefully controlled timing. But the internet did not wait for their schedule. Tuesday evening, one of the neighbor videos was uploaded to social media by the daughter of Franklin Yates, the neighbor who had recorded from across the street. It was 2 minutes and 47 seconds long. It showed the cuffing, the search, the scattered documents, and Judge Ashford's voice, clear as a courtroom ruling, saying, "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake." Within 12 hours, it had been viewed 4 million times. The headline was everywhere, on every network, every news site, every front page. ICE agents cuff black federal judge in her own driveway. No warrant. By Wednesday morning, 3 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee had publicly demanded hearings. The full committee opened a formal inquiry by Thursday. The Congressional Black Caucus held a press conference on the steps of the Capitol, calling the incident a grotesque abuse of federal power rooted in racial profiling. The Chief Justice of the United States was briefed in a private meeting with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. And then something happened that had not happened in over a decade. The federal judiciary, an institution that almost never speaks publicly on matters outside the courtroom, released a formal statement. It was 3 sentences long. It called the arrest of Judge Ashford an attack on the independence of the federal judiciary and a violation of the constitutional separation of powers. It said the judiciary expected full accountability from every agency and individual involved, and it said the courts would be watching. Those 3 sentences landed like a hammer inside every federal law enforcement agency in the country. 8 weeks later, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia returned its indictments. The charges against Craig Delano were devastating in their scope. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. 242, for detaining, cuffing, and searching a United States federal judge without a warrant, without probable cause, and without legal authority of any kind. Assault on a federal officer under 18 U.S.C. 111 for the physical force used against a sitting Article III judge, the grab, the spin into the side mirror, the compression against the hood, the cuffing, falsifying federal records under 18 U.S.C. 1001 for filing an incident report that was fabricated from the first word to the last, claiming resistance that never occurred, claiming combative behavior that every camera on the scene disproved, and conspiracy to obstruct justice under 18 U.S.C. 1512 for pressuring a subordinate agent to co-sign a false report and for attempting to construct a fraudulent official record designed to conceal the truth of what had happened on that driveway. Tara Schofield was charged with conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and falsifying federal records. The grand jury found that she had participated in the unlawful detention, had used physical force against a compliant subject, had co-signed a report she knew to be false, and had actively silenced a fellow agent who attempted to intervene. Kyle Rennick, the 28-year-old agent who had whispered "We need to stop," and who had called the OIG hotline that same night, was granted full immunity as a cooperating witness. He appeared before the grand jury and testified for nearly 3 hours. He described the operation, the stop, the cuffing, the search, the moment Delano held the judicial ID and chose to continue. He described the pressure to sign the false report. He described Delano's words exactly: "Sign it or your career is over." 2 additional agents from the team were named as unindicted co-conspirators for their participation in the warrantless search of Ashford's vehicle and their failure to intervene during the use of force. And the field office supervisor who had taken Delano's phone call from the driveway that morning, the call where Delano had paced and rubbed his forehead while a federal judge stood in cuffs behind him, was placed under a separate investigation for failure to act, because the question investigators wanted answered was simple: what did Delano tell him on that call? And why did it take a phone call to a supervisor for anyone on that team to uncuff a woman who had already identified herself, shown her credentials, and told them exactly who she was? The trial began on a Monday morning in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, the same courthouse where Judge Nadine Ashford had presided over cases for more than a decade. She was not on the bench this time. She was seated in the gallery, watching the system she had spent her career serving attempt to hold accountable the men and women who had violated it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution opened with the footage. They played the body cam recordings from Delano's camera, from Schofield's camera, and from a third agent whose chest-mounted unit had captured a wide angle of the entire driveway. They played all 4 neighbor videos, synced to a single timeline, projected onto a screen large enough for every juror to see every detail. The courtroom was silent. 12 jurors watched a federal judge in yoga pants get spun into a side mirror, pressed against the hood of her own car, and cuffed in her own driveway, while calmly identifying herself over and over again. They watched agents tear through her luggage. They watched sealed federal court documents get spread across a trunk. They watched Delano hold her judicial ID in his hand and order his team to keep going. Kyle Rennick took the stand on the fourth day. He described the operation from the inside. He described the moment he realized there was no warrant. He described the look on Ashford's face when the cuffs went on. He described whispering to Schofield that they needed to stop, and her response, "Shut up!" And he described sitting in the field office afterward, reading the incident report Delano had written, knowing every word of it was a lie, and hearing Delano lean in and say, "Sign it or your career is over." His voice broke once during testimony. He paused, took a breath, and continued. Beverly Osei testified as both a legal expert and an eyewitness. She walked the jury through the constitutional violations in clinical detail, then described what she had seen from her neighbor's lawn in language that was anything but clinical. She described a woman she had known for years, a woman who had dedicated her life to the law, being treated like a suspect in her own driveway by men who did not care what she said or who she was. Colonel Eldon Pratt, 68, retired Air Force, took the stand in a press suit and spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of a man who had spent 3 decades in military service. He described crossing his street in slippers and a bathrobe. He described shouting at federal agents. He described the moment Delano threatened to detain him for obstruction. And he described the look in Judge Ashford's eyes when her face was pressed against the hood of her car. "I have seen men and women in combat zones," he said. "I have never seen someone maintain that kind of composure under that kind of humiliation." Then Judge Ashford herself took the stand. The courtroom went still. She described the morning in detail. The coffee on the roof of her car, the garment bag, the sound of the SUVs, the moment Delano grabbed her arm, the impact of her shoulder against the side mirror, the cold metal of the hood, the tightness of the cuffs, the sound of her glasses hitting the concrete. She described the fear, the kind she had never experienced on the bench, the kind that lived in the body, not the mind. She described the humiliation of having her clothes pulled from her suitcase and spread across her own driveway. She described watching a man hold her judicial ID in his hand, read it, and decide it didn't matter. And then she said the words that would be quoted in every newspaper, every legal journal, and every civil rights filing for years to come. "I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. That morning, I learned how it feels when the Constitution fails to protect you." Delano's defense team argued good faith, wrong address, high-pressure environment, a rapidly evolving situation. They said their client had made an honest mistake under difficult operational conditions and that the force used was consistent with standard enforcement protocols. The prosecution dismantled the argument in a single afternoon. "If this was a mistake," the lead prosecutor said, standing directly in front of the jury, "then why did he write a report claiming she resisted? Why did he claim she was combative? Why did he pressure a junior agent to sign a document he knew was false? A mistake is going to the wrong address. A crime is what you do after you realize you went to the wrong address and decide to lie about it." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned on a Friday afternoon. Craig Delano, guilty on all counts, deprivation of rights, assault on a federal judge, falsifying federal records, conspiracy to obstruct justice, Tara Schofield, guilty on conspiracy and falsifying federal records. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Delano stared straight ahead. Schofield closed her eyes. In the gallery, Judge Ashford sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later in the same courtroom. Craig Delano stood before the bench in a Navy suit, no badge, no tactical vest, no sidearm. The man who had once told a federal judge, "I don't answer to you," now stood with his hands clasped in front of him, answering to a federal court. The sentencing judge, a veteran of the bench with more than 2 decades of experience, did not mince words. He looked directly at Delano as he spoke. "You did not merely make a mistake. You targeted, brutalized, and then lied about a sitting federal judge of the United States. You searched her vehicle without a warrant. You handled sealed court documents without authorization. You filed a federal report that was fabricated from beginning to end. And when a junior agent on your own team tried to tell the truth, you threatened to destroy his career unless he helped you bury it. You did not act in good faith. You acted with arrogance, with impunity, and with a belief that your badge placed you above the very laws you swore to enforce. The courts will not tolerate this. Craig Delano was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Tara Schofield stood next. She received 3 years. The judge noted that while her conduct was less aggressive than Delano's, her willingness to co-sign a false report, her active silencing of a fellow agent, and her failure to intervene during an unlawful arrest made her equally culpable in the conspiracy to cover up what had happened. Neither defendant spoke during sentencing. Neither apologized. Neither looked at Judge Ashford, who sat in the same seat she had occupied during the trial, watching the system deliver what the driveway had not. Within weeks of the verdict, Judge Ashford filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Craig Delano, Tara Schofield, the Fairfax Field Office, and the supervisory chain that had enabled the operation. The lawsuit cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, violations of the Fourth Amendment, and interference with a federal judicial officer. Discovery revealed internal communications, operational failures, and a pattern of complaints against Delano's unit that had been documented but never acted upon. The government's attorneys reviewed the evidence, the footage, the verdict, the public record, and recommended settlement. The case was resolved before trial for $4.6 million, one of the largest individual settlements in a federal civil rights case involving law enforcement. But the money was not the headline. The terms were. As part of the settlement, mandatory reforms were imposed on the Fairfax Field Office and adopted as a model across the agency. Independent civilian oversight of all enforcement operations involving residential addresses, revised protocols requiring warrant verification at every stage before agents made contact with any subject, anti-bias training administered quarterly with external review, a prohibition on conducting enforcement actions at any address not explicitly listed in the operational authorization, and a requirement that all incident reports be independently reviewed within 48 hours by personnel outside the reporting chain. The reforms did not undo what had happened on that driveway, but they made it harder for it to happen again. Craig Delano reported to a federal correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland, with nothing but a single bag of approved personal items. His 6-year career was over. His federal pension was forfeited. His name now lived permanently in the Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate database. Tara Schofield was barred from federal employment for life. Her security clearance was revoked. She had spent 7 years building a career by never questioning the person above her. That silence cost her everything. Leonard Stokes, the field office director, retired under pressure without ceremony. 2 supervisors were formally demoted for failing to act on prior complaints against Delano's unit. Kyle Rennick was transferred to a new field office and 6 months later received a formal commendation from the DHS Inspector General for demonstrating integrity under extraordinary pressure. He never spoke publicly about the case. He didn't need to. Judge Nadine Ashford returned to the bench. She declined interviews and book deals, but at a judicial conference 6 months later, she stood at the podium and spoke without notes. The law failed me that morning. But the people did not. My neighbors came outside. A retired colonel crossed the street in his bathrobe. A law professor stood on my driveway and refused to move. A young agent with everything to lose made a phone call that changed the course of this case. She established the Ashford Justice Initiative, funding legal defense for victims of unlawful federal enforcement actions. A training module based on the incident was adopted by DHS, the DOJ, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It included the full body cam footage, the false report, and Rennick's testimony. On the final slide was a photograph of her driveway, the handcuffs on the concrete, the scattered judicial documents, 3 unmarked Suburbans blocking the path of a woman who had done nothing but exist in her own home. Beneath it, in plain black letters, "This is what happens when power operates without accountability." Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, If you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes. Your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night, 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it. And I'll catch you in the next story.